Welcome to our study of the book of Revelation, looking at an overview of the book in 12 lessons. This particular class was taught for the British Bible School in a Zoom class on the 26th and the 28th of August 2020 as the UK continues to return to a new normality. Let's begin with just a brief review as to where we are in the book. In our last lesson, we saw the 7 angels who had the 7 final plagues to complete the wrath of God. The idea was, this was it. These were poured in quick succession, possibly simultaneously, and they resulted in the great city being split into 3 parts. Jerusalem was destroyed. You might think that with the destruction of the city, that the book would now draw to a close. But we still have 6 more chapters. The next 4 chapters will give more detail of what we saw in the destruction of the city in chapter 16. And I think that all of these are viewed properly as being part of the pouring out of the 7th bowl of God's wrath. Gene West commented on this in his commentary, and he said, if our appraisal of this book is correct, the 7th seal will not be fully opened, the 7th trumpet fully sounded, nor the 7th chalice completely emptied until we arrive at chapter 21. So, with each of these events dovetailing into the next, we continue our study of the pouring out of the 7th chalice, the 7th bowl of God's wrath. I think that's exactly what's going on here. The final 2 chapters will look at the result of all of this on God's people. This is our outline, and this is where we are in this particular lesson. We're on our 10th lesson in this series. In chapter 17, we're going to see the destruction viewed from what happened to a prostitute on the back of the beast. Then in chapter 18, we'll see the destruction described as the fall of Babylon the Great and the effect it had on the nations around them. So let's begin in chapter 17. One of the 7 angels told John that he would show him the judgment of the great prostitute who sits on many waters. This whole idea is based on Jeremiah chapters 50 and 51, and it talks there about the judgment of a literal Babylon, which took place in the 500s BC. The angel then carried away John. We'll get back to the prostitute in just a few minutes, but the angel carried John away in the spirit, it says, into the wilderness. So we have a scene change, and the emphasis is that what he's seeing is in the spirit. It's not literal, it's a symbol. And this whole idea here as well is from Isaiah 21 and verse 1. The whole idea of Israel being in the wilderness. Gene West wrote, the wilderness is a symbol of her heritage, destiny, the place where she always dwells. This is a very familiar prophetic picture of Israel in apostasy, plying her obscene trade along the wilderness roads like a wild donkey. And he references there Jeremiah chapters 2 and 3 and Hosea chapter 2. In the wilderness of sin, Jerusalem had established an intimate relationship with the dragon. I think that's the reason we have all these images going on there. But then John then turns to look at this prostitute that's riding on the beast. He says he saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast. That she's riding on the beast tells us that she is dependent on the beast for her very existence. He's supporting her. And as we've previously discussed, we'll discuss more in this chapter, the beast is Rome. We'll get that identification again in just a few more verses. But we believe that the beast is Rome is because it's so described in Daniel's vision. The 3rd kingdom was represented by a leopard in Daniel's vision, and it's identified specifically as being Greece. The 4th kingdom, the one that came after Greece, was described as a beast. And we know that the kingdom that came after Greece historically was Rome. It is described here as a scarlet beast, a red beast. Red symbolized war and the red horse. And of course, Rome was known for its wars and conquests. Red, by the way, is also used in the prophets to represent sin. Isaiah 1:18, though your sins be as scarlet, they will be as white as snow. And that would fit in here, I think, very well as well. The beast is also full of blasphemous names. The Greek word indicates being filled to the point of overflowing. So as we've seen earlier, this could be a reference to the emperors and their claim to be deity. So all of that seems to be happening here. But he goes on with the description. Mentions the beast briefly, but then gets back to the woman. The 7 heads of the beast, these seem to represent the major emperors and would indicate that the beast had complete intelligence and power. We'll talk more about some of that in just a few minutes. The 10 horns, we suggested earlier in a previous lesson that this may be referring to Rome being divided into 10 provinces. I think that works here. Horns, we find elsewhere, represent power. So the idea here seems to be that the prostitute was relying on the beast for power. John then began to describe the woman. The woman is dressed in purple and scarlet. She's adorned with gold. In fact, the Greek literally there is that she is gilded with gold, which is an interesting thought. And she is also adorned with precious stones and with pearls. She has a gold cup in her hand, which is said to be full of the abominations and the unclean things of her immorality. There's a name written on her forehead. It's her identification, which says Babylon the Great, the mother of the prostitutes, and of the detestable things of the earth. Now, what's interesting in contrast to this, if you think about the high priest in the Old Testament, the high priest also had an identification on his forehead. It was a plate on his forehead, but his plate said, Holiness to God. This is the exact opposite of that, isn't it? Her forehead, her identification, identifies her as the mother of prostitutes. Forehead, by the way, is used in the prophets as a symbol of rebellion. We find that in Isaiah 48 and Ezekiel chapter 3. This woman is drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses of Jesus. We'll comment more about that when it shows back up in the text in a few minutes. But John's reaction to all this was that he was amazed. In fact, Hugo McCord in his translation translates it that he was greatly amazed. The Greek literally there says, I marveled a great marvel. Or maybe we'd say, I was amazed with a great amazement. Totally amazed at her. Gene West asked a question about this. Did he marvel at her beauty, her evil, at how far she had fallen, or how anything as beautiful and as resplendent as this woman who represented Jerusalem could fall to such great depths? Perhaps his marveling and astonishment included all of these. Perhaps he stood in amazement, wanting to know the full explanation of all he had seen. He is amazed. When we see this prostitute, it should cause us to ask a question. Who is the woman? In the prophets, it's interesting that Jerusalem is described as a prostitute, having prostituted herself with the surrounding kingdoms. Jeremiah refers to Jerusalem as being a prostitute many times. Chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 13. Isaiah does as well, chapter 1. In Hosea, Israel symbolized by Hosea's wife, Gomer, who was a prostitute. That's in Hosea chapters 1 and 2. And in Ezekiel, both chapter 16 and chapter 23, Israel and Judah are specifically referred to as prostitutes, in quite graphic detail. That Israel in the Old Testament, when they wandered away from God, was described as a prostitute would seem to be telling us what this figure, this symbol in Revelation is supposed to mean. This is Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is also the only city in the book of Revelation that is called the Great City. Back in chapter 11, verse 8, we commented on it there. Logic tells us that the great city of chapter 11, which is identified as Jerusalem, the city where our Lord was crucified, must be the great city of chapter 17 in the image of a prostitute. And that she is drunk on the blood of saints. And later we're going to see in chapter 18 that in her is found the blood of prophets and of saints. That would again confirm that this is Jerusalem. Remember that Jesus said that Jerusalem was guilty of all the righteous blood shed on the earth in Matthew 23. The other popular view, by the way, is that the harlot is Rome as well. This view identifies this prostitute as economic Rome, while the beast is supposed to be civil Rome. My problem with this view is that the description we're going to get to in verse 16 is that the beast would hate the prostitute. The civil power hating the economy sounds to me like nonsense. How in the world would that happen? Civil powers are all for the economy, as we can see as we come through this coronavirus, and our economies has been seriously hurt as a result. Our civil powers are not hating our economy at all. By the way, the idea of Rome being on the back of Rome, Rome supporting Rome, Rome hating Rome, all of that doesn't make any sense. But Rome hating Jerusalem does make sense, to the point that Rome went to war against Jerusalem and Judea. Gene West commented that this woman cannot represent Rome, as many students aver, for you would have the Roman Empire sitting astride the Roman Empire. Rome depending on herself does not make a great deal of sense. However, someone else depending on her does. The woman is clearly intimate with the beast, though distinct from him. So I think this is a positive identification of who the prostitute is. This prostitute is Jerusalem. We also see some further identification marks here, as in that description. The prostitute is wearing purple. She is, or at least she's pretending to be, royalty, because purple was the color that royalty wore, being very expensive to dye it that color. The golden jewelry would be displays of her wealth that she's holding, and we would assume she's also drinking from the golden cup full of the detestable impurities of her vice. The prostitute sits on many waters. As I mentioned, these will be identified for us in a few more verses. It was the Jews, if you think about it, were the ones who so vehemently persecuted and killed Christians. We read about that throughout the book of Acts, do we not? Including those who were witnesses of Jesus. And we have James, the apostle, in chapter 12, being the first apostle to be martyred as well. So that all makes sense to be referring to the Jews in Jerusalem. In light of the reference to Jerusalem being a prostitute in the writings of the prophets, this reference to the blood of the saints and martyrs would seem to solidify that what we are seeing here is Jerusalem. The angel then asked John, after John mentioned that he was greatly amazed, the angel asked why he was amazed, and that he would explain to him this mystery of the woman on the beast. The beast is then here described as was, is not, and is about to go up out of the abyss. Those whose names were not written in the book of life and live in the land, in other words, the Jews, who are not God's people, would be astonished at the beast, in particular that he was, is not, and will be. And then the angel says, here is the mind that has wisdom. So wisdom is needed to understand this. And the angel then goes on to explain in a bit more detail. He begins by saying the 7 heads are the 7 mountains on which the woman sits. And I believe here that this is referring to Rome. Rome had 7 hills it was built on. Now, you might add that Jerusalem did as well, and that's very true, but this here seems to be that she's supported by it, and Jerusalem being supported by Jerusalem wouldn't make sense, the same as Rome being supported by Rome wouldn't make any sense. Or for that matter, Jerusalem supporting Rome. But anyway, but Rome is what supported Jerusalem. If it wasn't for Rome, the Jewish religious leaders would have had no power. Who was it that was appointing the high priests at this time and had been for a number of years? It was Rome. They were no longer following God's pattern for this being done. It could be as well that these numbers are not to be used in a literal manner. In other words, 7 hills may not be referring to literally 7 hills, but 7, of course, is that number in numerology that represents completeness. So possibly what this is saying is that the harlot is supported by complete political power. Isaiah 2, by the way, uses hills to indicate power. So maybe that's the idea. And we know Jerusalem was supported by the power of Rome, as we just mentioned. The angel goes on and says there are 7 kings, and these 7 kings explain the cryptic statement was, is not, and is to come. And what the angel says is 5 have fallen, that is the was, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. But when he does come, he must continue a little while. And then he mentions that the beast was and is not, is also an 8th, and is one of the 7th, and that he'll go into destruction. Now, it does take a lot of wisdom to understand that, doesn't it? It's not the easiest of things to understand, but let's give an explanation for it. First question that we should be asking ourselves. All right, who are these 7 kings and then the 8th? Suetonius, in all lists that I've ever seen from the 1st century, list the first 12 Caesars, and they always start with Julius Caesar. I've heard a number of people who, in our nice 21st century wisdom, want to say, hang on a second, Julius Caesar wasn't the first emperor. Well, he was a Caesar. He's recognized that in his name. They say, no, it really should start with Augustus. But it's interesting, that was not the way it was viewed in the 1st century. Gene West explained this. He says, some students of the book of Revelation deny Julius Caesar was the first emperor of Rome, beginning their list with Augustus. The earliest Roman, Jewish, and Christian writers counted Julius Caesar as the first emperor, as would any common sense student of Roman history. Suetonius, Roman historian and biographer of the emperors, counted him as the first. Josephus, in his Antiquities of the Jews, referred to Augustus and Tiberius as the 2nd and 3rd Caesars, which could be true only if Julius Caesar was the first. So I don't think it's good and proper, if we're going to allow the time period in which the Revelation was written, to not define who the Caesars were. And the contemporary writings of that time have Augustus and Tiberius as 2 and 3, and Julius as number 1, the first one. So that leads us, following Julius, we have, as we've mentioned, Augustus is the 2nd, and Josephus confirms that. Tiberius is the 3rd, Josephus confirms that. And we know historically that following him, we have Gaius, we may know him better as Caligula, and then after him was Claudius, and then after him was Nero. And then after Nero dies, assassinated, some say committed suicide. We explained last week, it seems like he was going to do that he did that, but he had his secretary do it because the Roman Senate was going to assassinate him. But when that happened, we had 3 Caesars in very quick succession. We had Galba, Otho, and Vitellius from 68 really to 69, but primarily in 69. And then finally Vespasian came along, and he reigned from 69 to 79, followed by his son Titus in 79 to 81. Those are the Caesars, and I've gone all ahead to Titus, even though that's a bit more than we needed, for a reason. I'll explain that in just a minute. Gene West, again, writing about this period, said this: at the time of the suicide of Domitius Nero Caesar, the Roman Empire virtually went out of existence for several months as civil wars raged. In quick succession, 3 emperors, Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, rose to power and were assassinated. Finally, Vespasian assumed the imperial crown, and through the ruthless actions of his legions, brought the empire back to a state of stability and power. She endured for another 300 years. Though he did not restore her to her former glory, he brought her from was and is not to yet is again. And I think he's right, although I'll hasten to add that there are 2 ways to view all these Caesars and how all this fits in with what John recorded here. They all agree on these facts, that the first 5, the ones who were gone at the time of writing, are Julius Caesar, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius. The one who is Nero. And then there's a couple different ways of looking at it. Some view it as it's Galba, Otho, and Vitellius looked at as a group who were about to come, which would make Vespasian then the 8th. Now, Gene West prefers this view. I think he's probably right here. But there's another view which I will mention. And this other view takes the same thing for the first part, but it skips over Galba, Otho, and Vitellius and goes to Vespasian as the one who's about to come, and then Titus as the 8th, who is like this the 7. Gene West rejects this view because it ignores the 3 brief ones, and because Jerusalem is long gone before Titus becomes emperor. So, going back to the view I think is correct. The 7th, it says, would only remain a little while. And by the way, Vespasian being the 7th, a little while doesn't really fit his reign, because he had quite a long reign as emperor. But if you think about these 3 here, and maybe it's the first one, or maybe it's one of the other short ones. Galba, 7 months, 7 days. Otho, 3 months, 2 days. Vitellius, 8 months, 5 days. So very, very brief reigns for these, then followed again by a longer one with Vespasian. Gene West wrote that the fall of the Julio-Claudian dynasty of Caesars was a severe blow to the Roman Empire. Neither Galba, Otho, nor Vitellius was able to rescue the empire from the utter chaos into which she fell. However, this is not the main point of what the angel had to say. The emphasis of the 11th verse is on the beast himself, the Roman Empire, with the angel pointing out the empire would make a comeback, and there would be further persecution for the people of God. I think that's the point in all of this. But I think, again, this points to the time of writing. The is Nero, and that identifies this as being written in the 60s, and therefore being about the destruction of Jerusalem. But the angel continues describing the beast. He says that the 10 horns are 10 kings who have not yet received power to receive a kingdom, but they will have brief authority with the beast, and the idea is it's going to be for 1 hour. They have one purpose: they give their power and authority to the beast. They will wage war on the Lamb, but the Lamb would overcome them because he is Lord of Lords and King of Kings. And with the Lamb are the called, and the chosen, and the faithful. That is, with him are the Christians. I think this, again, is plainly identifying for us that the beast is Rome. The 7 heads are the 7 Caesars. We saw that. The 10 horns would seem to be, we've mentioned this earlier, the 10 provinces making up Rome. These were Italy, Achaia, Asia, Syria, Egypt, Africa, Spain, Gaul, Britain's in there, as well as Germany. You may ask, well, where's Judea? Well, Judea was part of Syria, part of a greater one of the provinces. And these provinces had no real power. But what that little they had was, of course, from Rome. If you think about Herod ruling Judea, whether it be King Herod the Great or Herod Antipas or Herod Agrippa, they really had no real power. They were serving really as the proconsuls, but or the procurators, however you want to view them there. But they had no real power in and of themselves, although they're still recognized as king. And if all that's correct, the 10 kings having no kingdom would be the Roman procurators, and receiving authority for 1 hour would be talking about the time they spent as procurators, as proconsuls. They didn't rule for long. We can see that as we look down through Herod Agrippa and then Felix and Festus in the book of Acts. That they would make war with the Lamb, but the Lamb would overcome them. Yes, they did persecute the Christians without a doubt. But you think about it, no one really had a chance against the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He would conquer everyone. Their time, too, was coming. Gene West wrote, "This revelation shows the mind of God is set. So the harlot will be destroyed by the very beast on whom she is so dependent. This destruction came because she went to war against the innocent people of God." And that's exactly what happened. We're going to see that a little bit later on in the text as well. The waters, we finally get back to here. And it's identified for us, which is the reason we didn't speculate earlier. The waters are peoples, nations, multitudes, and languages, or crowds and languages. This is a symbol we find frequently throughout the prophets and throughout the Old Testament. Waters indicating people. Isaiah uses this many times, as well as Jeremiah and even the book of Psalms, and the list could go on and on. This could well symbolize the fact that the Jews were scattered amongst the nations of the world. And if you think again about the book of Acts, and as Paul went into the various Roman areas, which we'd say is in Turkey today, then on into Greece and whatnot, Macedonia, where did he go first? He went to find the Jews. He would go to the synagogues, or he'd go by the riverside where they were meeting. And so that they were scattered throughout the world. Gene West wrote that Jerusalem could truly be pictured as seated on many waters. She sat on the many nations of the empire through the pervasive influence she had in all its quarters. The synagogues of the Jews were everywhere due to the extent to which they were scattered. And that just confirms what we just earlier said. The 10 horns and the beast would hate the prostitute. That fits Jerusalem very well because Rome and the provinces hated the Jews. That's an historical fact. The word hate here isn't just talking about dislike. It's talking about an intense hatred causing people to turn against each other. We could refer to it as blind rage. And that's exactly what happened. And the description is that they would make her desolate and naked. Again, that's very similar to what we see in Ezekiel. They would eat her flesh and burn her with fire. In other words, they would destroy Jerusalem. If you remember, that's exactly what Jesus said was going to happen. "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to you, your house is left to you deserted." It's left desolate. Eating flesh, devouring her flesh may sound a bit strange to us, but that's a common phrase in the Old Testament, the prophets especially, when speaking of the destruction of a nation. Ezekiel 38 and 39 in particular, and especially chapter 39 from verses 17 on. And we find this symbol there. Gene, again, wrote in his commentary, "We should not be astounded by such a metaphor. After all, the harlot was dealing with a beast, and beasts eat the flesh of humans when given opportunity. This is, of course, a metaphor for complete destruction. Though this is a metaphor, we should remember it was the practice in bygone times for the defeated dead to be left for the scavengers." Daniel, by the way, in his prophecies, details the destruction of Jerusalem by Rome and parallels what we find here in chapter 17. But notice here the reason the kings, that Rome would do this. It says God put it in their hearts to carry out his purpose. Yeah, you see, God was in control of what was going on. All this was happening because this is what God wanted to happen. The woman is further identified as the great city which rules over the kings of the earth. Again, we mentioned this earlier. Jerusalem was called the great city back in chapter 11, verse 8. Josephus refers to Jerusalem in this way as the great city in his Wars of the Jews. Jerusalem did not literally rule over the kings of the earth, but then again, this is not a literal passage, is it? So we might ask, how figuratively did Jerusalem rule over the earth? And I would suggest she did that in that she was God's chosen at one time and had made alliances with so many nations. This is what Josephus had to say about the same concept in his War of the Jews. He said, "The royal city Jerusalem was supreme and presided over all neighboring countries as the head does over the body." That's a first century view of Jerusalem. Donald Taylor wrote, "It's important to understand that the harlot's influence was one of commerce rather than of military might or political power. It was the kind of power that a harlot would have over her lovers." Again, that does reflect very well the prophets in the Old Testament, and also is a good introduction into where we're going to go in chapter 18. I will point out before we enter chapter 18, though, that the Greek literally here, rather than saying ruling over the kings of the earth, is the one having a kingdom over the kings of the earth. And I was thinking, what better way to describe what had been God's kingdom but was no longer, as being a kingdom over the kings of the earth. John continues. After this, after John saw the harlot riding on the beast, another angel came down from heaven. This angel had great authority. The question a lot of people have is, who is this angel? Some suggest that maybe this is Jesus, because he's described as having great authority. I don't think so. I'll tell you why. The Greek word here for the word another means one like the rest. So Jesus is definitely not an angel like the rest of the angels, is he? Hebrew writer dealt with that very well in the first few chapters of Hebrews. So I think it's most likely the same messenger who spoke in chapter 14:8, announcing the fall of Babylon. The text does say the entire earth was illuminated by this angel's splendor, by its radiance. Sweet, who is quoted in Robertson's Word Pictures, said, "So recently has he come from the presence that in passing he flings a broad belt of light across the dark earth." Sort of makes us think about Moses coming down from Mount Sinai and having to put a veil over his face because, having been in the presence of God, his face glowed too bright for people to look at. And that may be the idea there. The angel then announced in a strong voice, "She has fallen, Babylon the Great." No longer was the city fit for human habitation. She was now a dwelling place of demons, foul, unclean spirits, and hateful, filthy birds. That same thing, by the way, was prophesied concerning Babylon in the prophets, Isaiah 13 and also Jeremiah chapter 50. But what this angel announced was fulfilled in the siege on Jerusalem by Rome. Foy Wallace wrote in his commentary, "The severance of all commercial affiliations by the siege of Jerusalem and the devastation of Judea had reduced the city to a haunt, symbolized by the demonic habitation of evil spirits, devils, and vultures. The overthrow of Tyre and Babylon in the Old Testament were combined in these same symbols." So again, this is something we can read about in symbol form in the Old Testament as well. The reason this was happening was quite simple. Jerusalem had committed fornication with the nations, with the Gentiles. And again, this is figurative, but it's also similar to the language used of Jerusalem before the destruction in 586 BC by Babylon. She had played the prostitute with all the nations around them. And the same thing was happening again in the first century. The Jews were so attracted to other nations. Think about that for a second. God's people were supposed to be his light to the world. Even the Jews were supposed to be a light to the world around them, to the Gentiles. Yet the Jews of the first century really had no interest in leading people to God. What they were interested in was how they could enrich themselves. One thing I think all this shows us, we get a bit of a glimpse into Jerusalem as a place of trade, a crossroads for traders, and it very much was that in the first century. Gene West wrote, "The merchants of the land of Israel had become rich and lived in opulent splendor as a result of Jerusalem's prostituting herself with Rome. This sentence was no doubt added to show the extent to which she prospered materially as a result of her rejection of God and his Son. It also shows her desire was centered upon material things rather than spiritual ones." And I'm sure there's a whole lesson we could bring out of this just from that last sentence that Gene gave us there. He goes on, and John heard another voice, and this voice was calling God's people out of Babylon. Again, we've seen that before, haven't we? This is parallel to Jesus' warning in Matthew 24, as well as Luke chapter 21, those verses that are there. Gene West wrote, Jesus told his disciples they were to escape Jerusalem when they saw she was being surrounded by armies, and he quotes from Luke 21. One may wonder why any Christians would remain in Jerusalem in light of the way they were persecuted. Indeed, one wonders, don't they? But they were called out so that they would not be involved in her sin and receive the plagues that the city would receive. The sins of Babylon had piled up as high as the heaven, and God remembered all that she had done and would pay back to her as she had done. In fact, not only would she receive as she had given, she would receive double. As Jerusalem had killed the prophets of God and even God's Son, she would receive double the same back. And history records, as we've seen earlier, that the Roman army withdrew briefly and the Christians exited the city. They came out of her as God told them to. And we have the sins of Jerusalem listed once again. Mentioned here is that she glorified herself and lived luxuriously. McCord translates that she lived lewdly. Rather than living the separated lives of God's people, she was wrapped up with the world. She thought she was a queen, but in reality, she was a widow. Why was she a widow? Because her husband, the old law, was dead. That's the way Paul uses that in the book of Romans, isn't it? And this, too, is from the Old Testament concerning Babylon. Isaiah chapter 47, verses 7 through 9. Jean commented that Jerusalem fancied herself a great and powerful queen because she rode on the back of the dragon's beast. She boasted she was no widow, meaning she would always sit on the back of the beast, never seeing sorrow. Though she did not see herself as married to the beast, she was his harlot or courtesan, settling as an earthly queen. That's a good description of what was going on. But because of her arrogance, all her plagues would come in a day. And we commented in our last lesson as to how quickly the plagues were poured out. Is he talking about one literal day? I don't think so. I think it could either be indicative of a short amount of time, and it was a short amount of time, and that may be the idea here, or it could be using one as it is used in numerology. One is a symbol for unity. So the idea may be that this is possibly happening, all these things would happen at the same time. That could be the idea. But notice what it says would happen. There would be death. Your translation may have pestilence. The Greek word literally is death, but pestilence does bring death, doesn't it? There'd be mourning. There would be famine. And all of these are things that happen when there's a siege. And then she would be consumed with fire, which is exactly what happened to Jerusalem. And again, we have this emphasis that the God who has judged her is a mighty Lord. This judgment is from God, and it's certain because he is mighty. Jean wrote, the outstanding element with which one is struck here is the number of allusions to the Old Testament books of Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Isaiah. Consequently, if one finds this language very familiar, it's because he's read a great deal of it in the Old Testament. This is a great help when one is attempting to interpret such language. Indeed it is. And we continually point out Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Isaiah, and sometimes some of the other prophets, and even the Psalms at times. When the city was destroyed, the nations and the kings of the earth who were involved with her were going to mourn. From a distance, they would see the smoke and would mourn her fall. And it seems to me they didn't go close as they didn't want to be caught up in what was happening to her. But why were they mourning? They were mourning not because they felt anything for the people, but because they had lost their source of pleasure. Their partner in fornication was gone. And keep in mind as well what was said in chapter 1 when Jesus would come. And it says there that all nations would mourn in verse 7. Look, he comes with the clouds. Every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all the nations of the earth would mourn over him. Yes, amen. And we said then, and I think this backs it up, chapter 1, verse 7 is not talking about the end of the world. This is talking about what's happening here. Jesus coming in judgment. And we see that the result of that is all nations, the kings of the earth, are going to mourn. In fact, not only were the kings of the earth going to mourn, the merchants would also mourn. And the reason they would mourn is quite simple. Again, it wasn't because they loved her, but that they would no longer have anyone to buy their goods. They would lose profit. And we have listed here all sorts of goods. If you think about these goods listed here, they are luxury items: gold, silver, precious stones, pearls, fine linen, purple and silk, scarlet, citron wood, ivory, items made from costly wood and bronze, iron and marble, spices including cinnamon and incense, perfume, myrrh, frankincense, olive oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle, sheep, horses, chariots or four-wheeled wagons you may have in your translation, as well as slaves. The Greek literally there is bodies of souls of men. All these are luxury items, but Gene West also pointed out in his commentary that most of these items were used in some way in the temple. That which they adored, the luxuries of life, they're going to lose in one fell swoop. Jean wrote that we understand to mean her wealth, luxury, opulence, and we might add decadence, would never return, and it never has. Those who made their living from all of this would stand at a distance due to fear. Fear, I'm sure, that they too would be slaughtered if they got involved. But the shock to their system seems to be that this happened so quickly. It's emphasized several times that this only took 1 hour. Jean wrote that it means their judgment, or the sentence resulting from the judgment already made, came on them swiftly and unexpectedly, just as the Lord said it would. But even those involved in the sea trade, the shipmasters, the sailors, they're going to react in a similar way. Notice here it says that they're going to throw dust on their heads. That's an Eastern symbol of mourning. They too are going to be mourning. Why are they going to be mourning? Their mourning again is focused on what they're going to lose in lost trade and wealth. But in the midst of all of this mourning, virtually for themselves, what they're losing, we find some rejoicing. The Christians, the people of God, the apostles, the prophets could rejoice because God had pronounced judgment for them against Jerusalem. The souls under the altar, if you remember, had cried out to God, "How long until you avenge what was done to us?" Well, God has now done it. This entire section reminds us of Ezekiel chapters 27 and 28, which is the lament of the nations of the world when Tyre would fall. Now, neither Tyre nor Jerusalem were the major cities of the world of their day, but they were important enough that when they fell, it affected those around them, particularly in lost revenue. A strong angel, mighty angel, then picked up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea. This was the stone that would be used in a mill, not the hand-grinding stone, but the big one. And notice as well, it wasn't a millstone. It was like a great millstone. That's the best thing he can think of to describe it. And this is representing the way Babylon would be thrown down suddenly with violence. The city would be no more and would not be found any longer. Gene West commented that only a few stones of ancient Jerusalem remain today. The buildings of what we call Jerusalem today were almost all constructed after the 6th century AD, and many of them as late as the 19th century. The rubble of the old city has been pushed into the hollows and ravines to make room for what is there now. Jerusalem will never be destroyed. But just keying off of what Gene said about the rubble being pushed into the hollows and ravines, very interesting. That's exactly what happened. If you visit Jerusalem today, you can go into the Archaeological Museum, which is just at the foot of the Temple Mount, and you can see those pile of stones there. Those stones are from the 1st century temple. That's about the only 1st century stones, except for the paving stones, that we saw when we were in Jerusalem, when we visited there. These stones were the stones that the Romans used fire and heat to blast from the Temple Mount onto over the edge of the wall. But this is what it looked like about 1880. Notice before we switch to the next picture, because it'll give you a point of comparison with the next picture, the upper part of this picture here, you see what looks like an arch starting to come out. That's Robinson's Arch. And notice the plants that are growing there and whatnot. But it's the arch I want you to see there. And then this is a drawing of the same scene from the 1880s. Notice that the arch is barely above the level of the ground. Why? What happened to all that? Well, the entire area was covered with rubble and rubbish. And over the more recent years, these have been excavated, and we have this pile of stones at the foot of the wall now. This here shows you how big these stones are, with the man who's standing there beside them, that were blasted from the temple by the Romans. Taylor suggests that all of this, maybe this being thrown down suddenly with a violence like a millstone, that may mean that the people of Jerusalem would be dispersed among the nations. The sea, being thrown into the sea, may represent the earth's multitudes. And I think as well, that makes sense, doesn't it? As well. By the way, these same words were used of old Babylon, as well as Tyre when they fell. Jeremiah 51, Ezekiel chapter 26. In a physical sense, Gene wrote, a city named Jerusalem still exists. But the Jerusalem which existed in the days when John wrote was forever destroyed. She could no more restore herself to her former glory than a great stone can rise to the surface of the sea. And maybe that's the idea of the millstone, that cast into the sea, it would never rise again. The description goes on that the sound of musicians, harpists, flautists, trumpeters, other instruments, would not be heard any longer. These are the sounds of life. And not only life, but life filled with pleasure, aren't they? No craftsman's mention would be found there, nor would there be heard any sound of work. No light would be found there at night. There would be no lamps burning. No voices of bride and groom would be found. All this is simply saying that everyday life was going to cease. And again, this is images that come from before the first destruction of Jerusalem by Babylon. Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah all record similar things in their prophecies. The merchants of the cities we find here were persons of importance on the earth. They are great men with great businesses. But notice, they were led astray because of their witchcrafts, because they deceived the nations. All this whole picture here is of the total destruction of the city. Life there would cease to exist. And the reason for all of this is in that last sentence there. The blood of prophets and of saints and of all those who have been slain on the earth was found in her. And again, we pose the question of what city was this said? Well, it was said of Jerusalem, wasn't it? And we've quoted it so many times that Jesus himself said this in Matthew chapter 23, and the description there in chapter 24 of Matthew of Jerusalem being destroyed. Ray Hawk wrote in his study of the book of Revelation, although Rome persecuted the church and destroyed Jerusalem, she's not said to be the one that all the righteous blood shed upon the earth would come upon. Jerusalem is. And I think, again, that nails it down, at least for me, that all this is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And not only did Jesus say that this would happen, this fits. This fits so well historically what happened. By the way, it's just a coincidence that we are recording these chapters this week because we are approaching the 1950th anniversary of these events. It's going to take place on Saturday of this week. August the 29th of 2020 is the 1950th anniversary. This is from Today in Christian History, which you can read on Christianity Today's website. 29th of August, AD 70, Romans burned the gates, entered the temple courtyards of Jerusalem, and destroyed the temple with fire. Within 3 years, Jewish resistance ends in a siege of the Herodian fortress of Masada. Rather than be captured or executed, the zealots committed suicide when it became clear that the Romans would soon breach the walls. And I'll probably comment a little bit more about Masada in our last lesson, or maybe in our next lesson, as to what happened there. That brings us to an end of chapter 18. In our next lesson, in chapter 19, We're going to continue to see the events of chapter 16 expanded. So it's continue being the fall of Babylon, but we're going to see the marriage supper. It's not what's depicted here in the picture. But then in chapter 20, we will see Satan and the lake of fire. And so we'll discuss those chapters there. So if you get a chance before you view our next lesson, read chapters 19 and 20. But for that matter, reread chapters 17 and 18. And I hope that this has been of benefit to you. I hope you can see why I take the view that I take on Revelation. To me, it fits the history so very well as what was written in the first century. But we hope you'll come back and view our next lesson as well. But thanks for joining us for this particular lesson.